Okay, I'm back with starting with chapter 13 or continuing with chapter 13, Twisted Confessions by Bryan Bloom. I did want to make a comment. In the last chapter, it was stated a couple different times that this guy, Terry Tyson, who's giving financial advice, making millions of dollars, obviously advertising to a lot of people, and a fair amount of people listen to him, right? So that's the fictional world. In the real world, I've mentioned who this person is that they're really referencing in this fictional book. Um, and the notation that he doesn't need a license, right? We all have to be really careful as financial advisors. And I put all of us in this big group, including insurance agents, even though we're not like certified financial advisors. We're certainly licensed to provide information. But we have to be really careful because of something called FINRA, which is the governing body over basically stock advice or securities advice. And this gentleman has probably made more than most in the financial space, but he has no licenses. He's not a certified financial advisor. He's not a licensed agent. He's not a licensed mortgage officer. And so, how is it that people that have chosen this field and put themselves in the jurisdiction of being monitored for what they say, and otherwise they're liable as fiduciaries watching out for the best interest of their clients? How is it that there is this so-called financial entertainer who doesn't even have to have a license and he can say whatever he wants? And as long as he's promoted, obviously some at some point somebody gave him a chance, and then he got on the radio, and then it got picked up by other shows. And many people talk about the fact that he did good work and getting people out of debt, but he didn't really educate them about the idea of good debt and not so good debt. Um, so it's not a blanket statement, that debt is bad. Uh, but he helped a lot of people try to get disciplined, right? He was like their pastor in that way, their financial pastor. So that's enough said for now. And I'm going to start with or continue with the book in chapter 13. It's Thursday at 1 p.m. Detective Whittier sat on the edge of his second-hand couch, his knees crunched up to his chest from the sunken cushions that had outlived their comfortable insides. He used one finger to tap his laptop to life and the other finger to tap his temple as if the repeated motion would bring Jane Lawrence's killer to light. Tap, tap, tap. He drummed his finger, and closed his eyes, repeating the mantra, think outside the box. The four words had been spinning around in his head all day, making him dizzy with questions. The Financial Truth Club lived by the metaphor, encouraging their believers to bend outside the traditional norm of saving money. Or at least that was what Chris had gathered so far. While he had heard the analogy before and knew what it meant, it was the first time he had ever really activated it in his life. The Marine Corps wanted the opposite for its recruits, and thinking outside the box was not something that he had ever put into action before. He accidentally came across the term while trying to dig up clues, but he was realizing that it might help him in his everyday detective work. Think outside the box. He said the words again as he navigated his browser and tried to come up with a reason why Jane Lawrence would have a suspicious caller from a California area code. Ross Jackson had called him a few moments ago, speed talking his way through the information he'd gathered from a man who was a big secret up until this point. It was clear the finance professor knew little about police work. When he called with the update, he didn't stop to think about the fact that he would have to share the man's name who gave him the information. That man, allegedly the boyfriend of Jane Lawrence at the time of her death, would have to be interviewed. Ross Jackson had not been keeping up on his police shows. Everyone knew that the male love interest was always the first to be suspected. It was particularly concerning that Ross didn't even have the knowledge that Craig and Jane were dating two of his so-called best friends. Since he wasn't at the station with access to the national phone number base, he opted to use the account that he had set up a long time ago to reverse look up a phone number. Technology today had some great advantages, but not when it came to tracing a caller. It wasn't like the days when everyone relied solely on a landline. Now it was easy for a criminal to get their hands on a burner phone, leaving no traces behind. The cheap, prepared flip phones could be destroyed in seconds, long after they were used to commit a crime. Chris knew that he had his work cut out for him. The reverse phone number lookup site came to life on his screen and he punched in the digits, reciting them out loud to himself. 559-555-1316. The area code sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. Having lived in a half a dozen different states since he was a kid, area code and mailing addresses had a tendency to blend together into mishmash of residences and memories. The secrets he lived on and the school he attended in Rhode Island as a child, the streets he had lived on and the school he had attended in Rhode Island as a child could easily be mixed up with the recollections he had had of the apartment complex he lived in as a teen in Oregon. Twisted Straits had become home to him, taking the record of the longest place he had set down roots. He no longer attached himself to the notion that he was a drifter, and he took pride in sticking around one place long enough to have the same state listed on his license plate. 559, 559. Chris repeated the numbers while he watched the timer grow and shrink as it searched for the phone number's home. He picked up the cold slice of pizza that was on the coffee table, held by nothing but a lonely paper towel. Leftovers were the go-to more nights than not, and the majority of the time, the homemade meals he did have were made by his sister-in-law. Megan was a top-notch chef and conveniently doubled her dinner recipes every night she had time to cook after putting in countless hours at the accounting business she ran one town over. She would always act as if she accidentally made extra, but he knew better. The woman looked out for him like a mother, and he often felt like his brother's oldest son. He joined his nephews on the couch every Christmas and around the table every Thanksgiving, contributing store-bought sides and gift cards. Chris swallowed the last bite and massaged his jaw, relieving the tension he had created from chewing the stale slice. The list of results presented themselves on the screen. California. He said the word out loud. California was the state that came closest to home for him, having spent more time there while in the Marine Corps than anywhere else in his past. He continued reading. The area code's information included a tidbit about how it was to assign to the central part of the state. He had been attached to the 1st Marine Division Headquarters Battalion just outside of San Diego on Camp Pendleton, southern part of the state from 1999 until 2005, before he was honorably discharged and left the state and the old area code behind. The fact that the area code was a California one meant nothing. Having worked with burner phones in the past, he was well aware that a suspect could easily attain one and even have a specific area code assigned to it. Chris would have had to start from scratch with what he did know. Someone was harassing Jane Lawrence before she was brutally murdered, and there were only a few other places where he had potential to find legit clues. Thursday at 5 p.m. Hey, Rivers. Chris handed over Officer Everly Rivers a cup of steaming coffee. He always felt Bad for the unlucky officers who got assigned to watch a crime scene. It was part of the job, and he paid his dues, standing for countless hours at a time as boredom got the best of him. So he emphasized, "Hey, detective, what brings you here on this lovely evening?" Everly rose from the lone folding chair that was set up at the area showcasing the entrance and exit of the scene where Dean Lawrence was murdered. Yellow tape circled the perimeter of the building that held Jane's office. "Oh, just decided to bring you coffee." Chris handed over the medium black coffee with a bag containing an assortment of cream, sugar, and sweet and low. Everly was new to the Twisted Straits Police Department, and Chris hadn't had a chance to memorize her drink order yet. "Thanks, just what I needed." She took a sip and swallowed without wincing. So Chris confirmed that she preferred her coffee black. "I can imagine. So really, why are you here? Nobody's been here for hours." Things move slow in small towns. Chris adjusted the strap on his black leather crossbody bag. Everly Rivers moved to Twisted Straits for the job. Originally from Chicago, she made it known that she wanted to gain some experience as soon as possible before she moved on to a bigger city with more crime. So she scooped up the nearest open position that didn't require a lot of experience. She wanted action, but she had to start somewhere, and her determination didn't go unnoticed on Chris. She was constantly asking him questions about cases that spanned in severity, showing that she truly wanted to absorb everything she could. I noticed. Everly shifted her gaze around the quiet campus. The early gusts of wind had come to a standstill. The air was raw, adding to the ominous gray clouds that were moving overhead. A recent time change had brought with it an earlier nightfall, and although it was only 5, it felt like it was much later. "So, you see anyone suspicious lurking around?" "No, just a few creepy reporters." Everly rolled her green eyes and rested one hand on her hip as she took another gulp of coffee. Her gaze settled onto him, and her lips transformed into a straight line. She was all business. "So, got any suspects yet?" "Nothing. A few leads, but no one I can claim as an official suspect." She raised her eyebrows and looked around again. He picked up on the question she was silently asking. Why was he here? "I just want to do another sweep of the crime scene. Maybe discover something that went unnoticed before." "Cool. Well, if you need any help or assistance, picking apart clues in there, I'm your gal." She winked. "You'll be the first person I call. I'll remember when I'm solving crimes in the big city someday." Everly laughed as she went back to work, removing 2 keys from the ring that was attached to her belt loop, one to get into the building and one to open Jane's office door. "I have no doubt you'll be the next real life Nancy Drew." She dangled the keys in front of him with a question on her expression, and that was the moment he felt old. She had never heard of Nancy Drew, the iconic fictional female detective who had been around longer than his grandfather. Never mind. He blew out a breath of air. Working with rookies always made him feel old, and as much as he tried to push his sister-in-law's voice out of his head, it was highlighted repeatedly in these situations. You need to put yourself out there and find a nice girl to settle down with. You're not getting any younger, Chris. The windows in the hallway were small, allowing for limited light to open up the dark space. He kept his eyes trained on the glow that spilled from the door at the end of the corridor, where Jane's office was tucked away. A chill cut through his spine. This building was home to a hospital years ago, long before the college had established itself, and long before he was born. It had been where all the old time residents were born, the few that were still alive. The entryway to Jane's office was marked by more yellow tape. One end was still securely fastened to the doorframe, while the other had fallen to the ground, reaching outward like a long yellow snake. The tail danced back and forth as if it was being held by a rhythmic gymnast. during a performance. Another wave of heat crashed through Chris as he looked around the space, trying to determine what would ignite the movement. The window that sat off center behind Jane's desk was halfway open, sending in a draft of air. Chris shook his head, ashamed of his reaction to the moving tape. He knew the window was open. It was part of the crime scene. Keep everything as is. When Jane's body was discovered, the window was halfway open, and that was something that had felt unsettling to Chris. The coroner determined that she had been dead for more than 24 hours by the time she was found, so that meant the killer had likely done the deed the day before, which was either very late Saturday night or early Sunday morning. Being addicted to his own job, Chris knew that it wasn't rare for a dean to be on campus on a weekend. But one thing that didn't lie was the weather forecast. And according to the badge swipe machine, the overnight janitor clocked in at 2:30 a.m. and left at 3:30 a.m. His only job was to mop the hallway floors before classes started the next day. The janitor, Ringo Lillard, had been Chris's first suspect, the one he thought was a shoo-in as the murderer. The guy had a key to every office in the building. He was there within a vicinity of time where Jane's body had gone lifeless. But also attached to Ringo's name was a stellar track record, having worked for the university for 40 years without a single complaint against him. While beyond his retirement years, Ringo, well beyond his retirement years, Ringo lived with his loving wife, Elizabeth, and they raised their young grandchild together. But the biggest clue of all that took Ringo off the list of promising suspects was the fact that he was only 5'7", not to mention he was a frail 75-year-old who was miraculously still working a physical job. According to his wife, Ringo refused to stop working because it brought in some extra money to pay the taxes. The entire weekend before Jane was discovered, the weather had been unseasonably cold. He remembered several small talk conversations about how the time change came right on time when the temperatures dropped. The banter around town and at the station was that the drop in degrees was a warning it was going to be a cold winter. So, why would Jane Lawrence have her window open on a day when it was only 25 degrees? The average November temperature in the Midwest, according to local resident quasi-famous meteorologist Wyndham Roberts, was 43 degrees. From what Chris gathered during his first sweep on the outskirts of the building, there was no recognizable footprints, simply a boxy hedge that lined the building and appeared to be uninterrupted. Chris thought back to the conversation he'd had with Wyndham, was setting up for the weather show he had hosted as a volunteer to the Twisted Straits local television channel. The stout, bald man had been ecstatic about the drop in temperature as if it was a notorious event in his longtime career. He walked around the station, gesturing manically as he recounted every winter in history that came close to this particular drop. Needless to say, he was disappointed when the temperature shot back up the following day, when Jane's body was discovered. While her office didn't reflect it now, Jane struck Chris as a tidy woman. Maybe it was the fact that he had some type of underlying belief that anyone who chose to work with numbers was organized. Artists were known for their disarray and ability to focus in the midst of chaos, whereas people who dedicated their lives to truth had to be detailed and orderly. Equations were uniform. There was only one answer, whereas art was subjective. Chris pulled on his gloves, trained on not messing up evidence, and worked his way across the office, stepping over an outline of where Jane's body was lying face up, eyes directed at the ceiling. He set his bag on the floor, crouching down to rifle through the crime scene photos. First, several images were of the misplaced objects found at the scene. According to her colleagues, Jane wouldn't leave books scattered on the floor, fallen from the shelf that sat perpendicular to her desk, nor would she have torn down an LSU poster that clung to the back of her door. Both signs that the murderer admitted hostility moments before he took the knife to the left side of her neck, slicing the branch of her carotid artery, instantly halting blood flow to her brain. That was all it took to put an end to someone's life forever, sending a ripple of pain through a community. He fanned the photos out on the floor beneath him, taking in Jane's pale skin, the contrast of her auburn hair. She had been beautiful. There was no doubt about that. Chris stood up, stepping into his fighting pose, putting himself in the shoes of the killer. He faked a jab with his right hand to the left side of her neck, confirming that the suspect would have to be right-handed to make a solid slice on the first try. With his left hand, he reached forward and executed a pulling down motion where the killer grabbed Jane's hair while he stabbed her one time. It had been planned, that much Chris could confirm. The suspect knew what he was doing, and he knew Jane would be in her office. It was someone close to her. His best guess was that it was a jealous boyfriend, which was why he was anxious to interview Craig Lipton. He let out a long, overdue breath and looked up around the office, opening his mind up to the possibility that it was anyone else but the boyfriend. That's when his gaze landed on a dried pink rose petal that peeked out from the top of the book on the shelf. Thursday, 5:57 p.m. It was nearing 6 o'clock by the time Chris pulled into the one lonely spot dedicated to Twisted Vine customers. After he paid Claire a visit to inquire about the pink rose petals, he had to call the crime scene investigator that was assigned to the department. In addition to the petals, he found two other items in Jane's office that might come in handy. One was a picture frame of Jane and Stephen Ileson, dressed in their best at an event. After he finished up in Jane's office, he stopped by Stephen's office, tucked in the corner at the other end of the building, curious about the man who was allegedly missing. This was where he discovered the snapshot, framed and centered on the massive mahogany desk, right alongside a photo of Stephen and his wife on their wedding day. If Terry Tyson hadn't been crammed between them, he wouldn't be able to tell who was the real couple. Stephen and his wife, or Stephen and Jane. The two looked like a pair standing on either side of the finance guru, her in a green dress and him in a navy blue suit and green tie. Before Stephen Ileson had gone missing, this photo wouldn't have set up a red flag, but Chris's intuition was heightened as soon as his eye caught the image. He remembered how angry the man got when he interviewed him at the station. Did he happen to fly off the handle and kill Jane in a fit of rage? Had the flowers really been a romantic exchange, and he had everyone fooled that they were a get well gift for Jane, suggested by his wife? Looks like he'd have to meet with the wife next. The other piece of evidence that piqued his interest was the infamous Confessions of a CPA book that had been conveniently popping into Chris's life since the start of the case. This time it was tucked between two other finance books on Jane's shelf. He bagged the book as evidence, with the petal tucked in between two pages. So far, he knew that Dwyer Edmonton had frequented the Twisted Vine for pink roses on what seemed to be a regular basis. But who else was purchasing these pink roses? And how many pairs of hands did they come across before one lonely petal happened to serve as a bookmark for the popular paperback? Chris walked towards the store, dodging the first raindrops that made their way towards the ground. The sky overhead had been growing darker and more ominous since he set foot in Wesley Hall. He gripped the evidence box that held the bag with one hand and pulled the door open with the other, nearly crashing into Claire as she flipped the black and neon sign from open to closed. Yikes! She took two urgent steps back, avoiding a head-on collision with Chris. It's never a good sign when the local detective enters a store at closing time, she laughed. Chris looked at his watch. It's 5:58. Yes, you are correct. Technically, you have 2 more minutes to shop, but the impending storm, I'm pretty confident that our regular clientele won't be stopping by during that time, so I figured it was safe to switch the sign. Claire Donahue was enjoyable to be around. In the two brief encounters Chris had with her, she managed to ease his stress with her humor and the easy smile that always landed on her face, regardless of the topic they were conversing about. Her disposition was matter of fact, and nothing seemed to shake her to the core, which somehow made Chris want to be around her, as if she was a magnet pulling him toward her. She dropped her gaze to the box in his hand. I'm guessing you're not here to check on our inventory. Actually, I kind of am. She led him back to the wobbly table. Care for some tea? She reached for a green thermos on the shelf behind the cash register. Sure. Chris wasn't much of a tea drinker, but he found himself agreeing to the offer. She opened a file cabinet drawer and retrieved a red cup with a black business logo on it. Orange spice, okay? Is that my only choice? How did you know? She looked over the base of the thermos at him as she poured hot water into the cup. Just a guess. He accepted the red cup from her, taking in the black and white car speeding across the bottom. Your experience as a detective has paid off. She smirked and dropped a tea bag into the cup before she sat opposite him in the wobbly chair. So what can I do for you? Well, this is probably going to require a lot of tedious work for you, but is there any chance you can tell me all the names of your customers who have purchased pink roses over, say, the past month? He smoothed the top of the box with his palm, careful not to shake the petal that was still held in place by the book, and opened it gently. Claire tilted her head to the side and moved her eyebrows into a contemplative crinkle. What makes you think that petal is from this store and that it's only a month old? You're going to make this a lot harder for me, aren't you? Flowers aren't as simple as you think. Claire set her teacup on the table and leaned forward, assessing the Ziploc bag. First of all, that petal is much younger than a month old. Petals start to wilt in about 3 days, and when they dry and crumple up, unless they are placed in a book, which is obviously what happened in this case. Claire paused, unless what? Unless this petal was baked when it was still soft, and then held in an airtight container before it was placed in the hands of the bookshelf of the victim. Okay, so if the petal was found on Dean Lawrence's, the victim's bookshelf, and pressed down between a book, then it's doubtful that the person gifting the flowers actually took the time to bake the petals. She paused, pinching the Ziploc freezer bag with the tips of her fingers. That book isn't super thick, though. Usually, when someone wants to dry out a petal, they place it in a book with substance, like a dictionary or an encyclopedia or even a Stephen King novel. Claire rose from her chair and squeezed into the tight space to position herself in front of the store computer. I'm going to be honest with you. This might make your job harder. We sell a lot of pink roses here. So are you telling me that they were purchased here? No, I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you there is a good chance they were, considering the nearest florist is 2 towns away. And let's just say they specialize in succulents. Chris didn't know the difference between a succulent, a cactus, and a plant, but knew he'd feel a bit more hope if he had had a list of people who purchased pink roses. The sound of a long groan emitted from behind Claire, and Chris watched as he turned and pulled a printout off an ancient printer. Okay, here's a list of all the customers who purchased some form of pink rose or another. Her blue eyes scanned the list, expanding and shrinking every now and then. Chris wondered if she was questioning which of her customers may be suspected of murder. She kept her gaze on the sheet as she sunk into her chair and removed a pencil from behind her ear, like all the movies Chris had ever seen that featured a librarian. Chris leaned forward, letting out a long whistle. Who knew pink roses were so popular? She placed the sheet on the table between them. The printout showed all the sales that had inventory number, had the pink rose inventory number. It's used to be it used to be just a teenage girl thing, but now it seems like it's a twisted straights thing. There are 42 pink rose purchases on this list. Yeah, but a lot of those are from the same people. Notice several of those credit card numbers are identical. Claire leaned forward and used a finger to annotate the last four matching numbers of the cards. Does anyone use cash anymore? Claire lifted an arched brow. You have no idea how long it took me to convince my dad to splurge on a credit card machine. So I'm personally grateful that we don't have a lot of cash spenders. But I digress. They are typically our older customers, and for whatever reason, the elderly don't seem to be into pink roses. They stick with zinnias and mums. Chris passed her a confused expression. They last longer, harder to kill. Makes sense, Chris paused. So from here, we'd find out who the credit cards were owned by. You're on the ball today, detective. You've got plans tonight? Claire looked at her watch, then around the store as if searching for something. Taking inventory? Do you like Italian? Who doesn't? I'll buy I'll buy if you help me match up the credit card numbers with the customers. Do I have a choice? Claire smiled, showing that she was a do-gooder by nature. If Chris had to guess, she secretly wanted to help him solve the case. Technically, yes. Deal, but only if you get me a double order of the garlic bread from Rizzo's. You got it. Chris adjusted his position on the floor of the twisted vine. If he wasn't sitting beside Claire, he would have loosened his belt loop. It turned out that Claire wasn't capable of eating a double order of breadsticks, and he polished off the majority of the buttery sticks as he went to work, writing down names of the pink petal purchasers. The list ended up being shorter than he expected. Some of the names stood out among the others as if they were circled with a highlighter, screaming to be investigated further. Dwyer Edmonton had come to the store almost weekly to purchase pink roses, but according to Claire, he was a safe bet and a friend of the family. Dwyer wouldn't know how to hold a knife if he tried, and half the time he's so lost in his own dream world, he would get lost finding his way to the dean's office. What about Luke Grindstaff? Claire raised her eyebrows. The valedictorian of the class of 2005? She wagged her head side to side. Never in a million years. Okay, who is Josh Williams? My sister's flavor of the month. Claire used Chris's shoulder to heft herself up off the floor. Nope, not your guy. How are you so certain? Well, I'm not. And come to think of it, Izzy doesn't have the best taste in men. But I don't know. I think this one might be a keeper. What makes you think that? He's a gentleman. Is that why he purchased pink roses? Yes, but I'm pretty sure he didn't purchase them for her. Blair stopped mid-sentence, catching on to her words before Chris could point out the massive elephant sitting between the two of them. If the guy Izzy was dating didn't buy flowers for her, then who did he buy them for? And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give me your feedback. And yeah, let's talk. It's all in the comments section where you get on a calendar event with me and we could talk about your situation. Thanks.